What's going on, guys? And today, open up your brain tank for this premium octane knowledge that'll be coming your way about Israel Epstein. The TLDR was that he was a Chinese journalist who was one of the few non-Chinese origin, foreign-born Chinese citizens to become a member of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. So, let's get right into it. Born a stateless Jewish refugee in the twilight of the Russian Empire, Epstein transformed into a prominent journalist of the Chinese Revolution and eventually rose to become a high-ranking cadre within the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. His life trajectory spanning the Jewish Bundist movement in Warsaw, Poland, the colonial concessions of Tianjin, the battlefields of the Second Sino-Japanese War, the internment camps of Hong Kong, and the solitary confinement cells of Qincheng Prison, offers such a weird lens through what we're going to examine, the transnational currents of a recent modern revolution history. So if you enjoy this type of content, hit that like and subscribe button. And let's get right into it. Israel Epstein was born 1915, April 20th, besides being a great day today for 420. It's one that seems to have a lot of interesting folks born on it. He, Israel Epstein, was born in Warsaw, a city then under the domain of the Russian Empire. Today it's modern-day Poland, but on the precipice of a catastrophic change. To understand the ideological scaffolding of Epstein's later life, we must first dissect the environment of his infancy. The Russian Empire was crumbling under the dual pressures of World War I and internal revolutionary ferment. Warsaw was a nexus of this instability, particularly for its Jewish population. You'll probably be thinking Ashkenazi Jews if you know about the ethnicity groups within Judaism. I'm a Sephardic Jew, which found itself caught between the anti-Semitic policies of the Tsarist regime and the advancing German imperial army and the rising tide of Polish nationalism. Epstein was not merely born into a Jewish family. He was born into a lineage of active militant resistance. His father, Lazar Epstein, was a dedicated leader in General Jewish Labor Bund, the Bund, a socialist organization that championed the rights of Jewish workers and advocated for cultural autonomy within a secular socialist framework. The Bund stood in fierce opposition to both Zionists, which they viewed as a kind of like a bourgeois diversion, and the religious orthodoxy of the traditional Jewish establishment. This specific brand of socialism, secular, internationalist, and deeply rooted in the struggle for labor rights, was the primary intellectual inheritance Lazar bequeathed to his son Israel. The Epstein family commitment to this socialist cause was not theoretical, but visceral. Lazar Epstein had been imprisoned by the Tsarist authorities for leading labor uprisings, a punishment that marked him as an enemy of the state. Similarly, Epstein's mother, Sonia, had suffered exile to Siberia, a common punitive measure used by the Romanov dynasty to neutralize political descendants. These experiences of state-sanctioned persecution instilled in the family a profound generational hostility towards autocracy and imperialism. For the infant Israel Epstein, these stories of imprisonment and exile were fundamental to his beliefs. They were kind of like foundational myths. They established a moral universe where resistance to oppression was the highest virtue, where state power was inherently suspect, a conviction that would ironically be tested and reconfigured during his own later service to the Chinese state. The outbreak of World War I shattered the fragile stability of the Epstein household. Lazar was sent by his company to Japan shortly after hostilities commenced, likely to establish commercial or political footholds in the East as European theater descended into chaos. This separation left Sonia and the infant Israel in Warsaw just as the Eastern Front moved dangerously close. In 1915, as the German army approached Warsaw, the situation for the Jews became untenable. The Tsarist military command, often scapegoating Jews as German sympathizers, conducted mass deportations and pogroms, violent riots aimed at massacre or persecution of an ethnic or religious group in the borderlands. Sonia made the desperate decision to flee. With Israel in her arms, she embarked on a perilous transcontinental journey across the disintegrating Russian Empire to join her husband in Asia. This migration was part of a larger diaspora of European Jews seeking refuge in the East, a flow of refugees that would eventually create the vibrant if transient, Jewish culture of Harbin and Shanghai. The family reunited in 1917, the year of the Bolshevik Revolution. This temporal coincidence is significant. Just as the Epsteins were leaving the sphere of Russian influence, the political cause Lazar had fought for, socialism, was seizing power in Moscow. However, the Epsteins did not return to the newly formed Soviet Union. Instead, after a period of transience and the included stops in Japan, potentially Harbin, they settled in Tianjin, China in 1920. Israel was 5 years old. While the shared experience of persecution bounded the family together, political ideology eventually drove a wedge between father and son. Lazar remained a staunch Bundist throughout his life, committed to democratic socialism and Jewish cultural identity. Israel, however, would drift towards the Marxist, Leninist, Maoist orthodoxy of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. The ideological divergence remained a simmering undercurrent until a dramatic confrontation decades later. In the 1970s, after Israel had survived the Cultural Revolution and China had begun to open up, he traveled to the United States to visit his father. By this time, Lazar was in a nursing home in New Jersey, operated by the Workmen's Circle Arbiter Ring, a mutual aid organization deeply connected to the Bundist movement. The reunion, after nearly 30 years of separation, quickly devolved from a familial embrace into a fierce political debate. Witnesses recounted that the father and son fell into a fierce war of words, with Israel espousing Mao's rhetoric and defending the Cultural Revolution, while Lazar vigorously defended the Bundist tradition and democratic socialism. A fellow resident of the home, overhearing the shouting match, remarked to Lazar, quote, "I haven't heard you so agitated since you spoke in Minsk during the 1905 revolution," end quote. This anecdote is crucial for understanding Israel Epstein's psychology. It reveals that his revolutionary fervor was not merely an intellectual adoption of Chinese politics, but a continuation of Jewish tradition of, quote, intense disagreement, disputation, and dialogue, end quote. Even in his rebellion against his father's specific political creed, Israel was enacting the very values of intellectual combativeness his father had instilled in him. Both men were atheists who agreed on the outmoded nature of religion, yet they found in their respective secular faiths, Bundism and Maoism, a cause worth fighting over until the very end. Tianjin in the 1920s was a hyper-colonial environment city, fractured into foreign concessions, British, French, Japanese, Italian, where European law reigned supreme and Chinese sovereignty was virtually non-existent. The Epsteins, as stateless Jews, later likely utilizing whatever papers they could secure, lived within this privileged bubble. However, Lazar and Sonia refused to insulate their son from the brutal realities lying just beyond the concessions gates. Epstein was raised with a, quote, strong sense of equality towards all people, end quote, a deliberate pedagogical choice by his parents to counter the pervasive racism of the treaty port society. While other foreign children were taught to view Chinese as servants or coolies, an offensive historical term for unskilled Asian laborers, Epstein was taught to view them as victims of an unjust global order. The 1920s in China were defined by chaotic warlord era, where rival military cliques fought for control of the fragmented republic. Tianjin, as a major port and commercial hub, was often the destination for waves of refugees fleeing the carnage in the hinterlands. The young Epstein witnessed scenes of destitution that permanently scarred his consciousness. He later recalls seeing, quote, gaunt, ragged refugees flooding into Tianjin, end quote, begging for food or offering to sell their children to survive. In one particularly harrowing memory, he recounted finding a boy about 12, his own age at the time, quote, crouching, stiff and dead in a doorway where he had tried vainly to seek shelter from the freezing night wind, end quote. These visceral encounters with death and poverty stripped away the glamour of colonial life, seeded the conviction and that the existing societal order was not only unjust but unsustainable. He began to ask fundamental questions that would guide his life, like, quote, who on earth could save China, end quote. Epstein's entry into the professional journalism was prodigiously early. At the age of 15, he began working for the Peking and Tianjin Times, an English newspaper established by the British architect William Bellingham. in the British concession. This was not a schoolboy hobby. He was a working reporter covering a city on the front lines of geopolitical tension. This role provided him with a unique vantage point. He had access to the teletypes and the gossip of the foreign diplomatic corps, but his sympathies lay with the Chinese streets. By 1931, the Japanese Empire began its encroachment in Manchuria, the Mukden incident. Epstein was already documenting the early tremors of the war that would consume the next decade of his life. Around 1933, a serendipitous assignment altered the trajectory of Epstein's life. He was tasked with writing a review of Far Eastern Front, a book by the American journalist Edgar Snow. To discuss the review, Epstein traveled from Tianjin to Beijing, then Peiping, to meet Snow, who was teaching journalism at Yanqing University. This meeting sparked a lifelong friendship and mentorship. Snow was not just a journalist, he was a conduit to the underground communist movement. In 1936, Snow made his historical trek to the Red Army base in Yanan, returning with the materials for Red Star Over China, the book that would introduce Mao Zedong and the Chinese communists to the world. Epstein was among the privileged inner circle who read Snow's manuscript before it was published. The impact of Snow's work on Epstein was profound. Red Star Over China provided a framework for understanding the bandits in the hills, not as chaotic rebels, but as disciplined progressive force offering a viable alternative to the corruption of the Kuomintang KMT. Influenced by Snow's progressivism, Epstein became an editor for Snow's magazine, Democracy, and fully committed himself to the anti-fascist democratic movement. 1937 to 1941, with the eruption of full-scale war following the Marco Polo Bridge incident in July 1937, Epstein transferred from a local reporter to a war correspondent for United Press International, UPI, and the other Western news agency. He left the relative safety of the northern concessions to follow the shifting front lines of the war. His reporting took him to the nerve centers of the Chinese resistance, Shanghai, which had fallen after a brutal 3-month battle, Nanjing, the site of the horrific massacre, and Wuhan, the temporary capital where the united front between the KMT and the CCP briefly flourished. In April 1938, Epstein traveled to the front lines to cover the Battle of Zhuang in Shandong Province. This battle was a monumental event, the first major Chinese victory over the Japanese Imperial Army, shattering the myth of Japanese invincibility. Epstein's coverage went beyond military tactics. He focused on the mobilization of the common people. He observed that the victory was made possible because the army stood with the people, enabling the peasantry to feel that defending the country was defending their own land. This confirmed his growing Maoist sympathies that People's War was the only strategy capable of defeating a technologically superior imperialist movement. The demands of war reporting exacted a heavy toll on Epstein's personal life. In 1935, he had married Edith Bihovsky, a fellow resident of the foreign community. However, as the war intensified, their paths diverged. Edith was reluctant to endure the hardships and dangers of the front line, while Epstein insisted on being where the action was. This fundamental conflict between personal safety and professional duty led to their divorce in the early 1940s. Edith later remarried as Edith Bolen, fading from the revolutionary narrative that Epstein was constructing for himself. In autumn of 1938, Epstein joined the Chinese Defense League, CDL, an organization founded by Soong Ching-ling, the widow of Sun Yat-sen and the matriarch of the Chinese Revolution, aka Soong Ching-ling, the organization that was run by Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen was the first president of the PRC, which is Taiwan. The CDL was a critical lifeline, channeling the international medical supplies and funds to resist forces, particularly the Communist 8th Route Army, which was a blockade by the KMT government. Working for the CDL placed Epstein in the inner sanctum of pro-communist left. He was no longer just an observer. He was an operational asset of the United Front, using his journalistic skills to publicize the Chinese cause to the West and solicit international support. By 1941, Epstein was based in Hong Kong, which had become an operational hub for the Chinese Defense League. The British colony was a precarious sanctuary, teeming with the refugees, spies, and revolutionaries. On December 8, 1941, local time, Simultaneous with the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese military launched an invasion on Hong Kong. The city fell on Christmas Day 1941. The Japanese occupation authorities, specifically the Kempeitai, the military police army of the Japanese, arrived with blacklists of anti-Japanese activists and journalists. Israel Epstein was a high-value target. Aware that his capture was imminent, Epstein executed a desperate counterintelligence maneuver. He faked his own death. The disinformation campaign was successful. He did it by going on newspapers and publicizing that he had died. The rumor of his demise was picked up by international wire services. A short item reporting his death even appeared in the New York Times in 1941. The strategic intent was to cause the Japanese to call off their manhunt, or at least to delay the intensity of the search, buying him precious time to go underground or secure a route out. Despite the decoy, the net eventually closed. Epstein was detained by the Japanese authorities. He was not executed, likely due to his stateless status or the confusion of the early occupation, but was interned in the Stanley internment camp located on the Stanley Peninsula on the Hong Kong island. The camp housed about 2,800 people, mostly British, American, and Dutch nationals, in the grounds of the St. Stephen's College and the prison warden's quarters. Conditions were harsh, food was scarce, disease was rampant, and the internees were cut off from the outside world. Yet within the camp, resistant networks formed. Epstein, however, had no intention of waiting out the war in captivity. Epstein's escape from the Stanley camp in March 1942 is a narrative of high adventure that underscores the multinational and cooperative nature of the resistance in South China. Epstein did not escape alone. He was part of a small multinational group. Crucially, this group included Elise Fairfax Chumley, a British journalist and fellow activist who would later become Epstein's second wife. The presence of women in this escape is kind of like really rare in wartime evasion, making this actually kind of a unique escape. So what happened was the group managed to slip out of the camp perimeter, likely exploiting a gap in the guards' patrol or utilizing the chaotic shoreline geography of the Stanley Peninsula, and commandeered an abandoned boat. Their vessel was this lifeline across the waters of the Pearl River Delta, which was patrolled by the Japanese Navy. They navigated to Lantau Island, the largest island in the Hong Kong archipelago. Lantau was a rugged, mountainous, and less tightly garrisoned than the Hong Kong island. Here they made contact with local Chinese fishermen. These fishermen were the unsung heroes of the escape. Without their knowledge of the tides, hidden coves, the escapees would have easily been recaptured. The fishermen transported them to Macau, a Portuguese colony, occupied a unique position in World War II. Because Portugal was neutral, Macau was not formally occupied by the Japanese military. Those under de facto influence of the Japanese advisors teamed with collaborators. It served as Casablanca of the Orient, a nest of spies, refugees, and diplomats. Upon arrival in Macau, the escapees were not left to fend for themselves. They were welcomed by Father Paulus, an American member of the Mary Knoll mission. Father Paulus and his colleagues provided the funds necessary for the next leg of the journey. They were taken to the British consulate in Macau, where they were met by Consul Reeves. Furthermore, Epstein required medical attention or a cover story. He contacted a physician named Dr. Tang. This contact was recommended by Sa Kong Liao, a Chinese journalist associated with the Democratic League and sympathetic to the CCP. From Macau, the group navigated into the porous border into mainland China, eventually making their way through the Japanese lines to reach the wartime capital of Chongqing. Safe in Chongqing, Epstein continued his work for the Allied press. In 1944, he was selected as part of a rare delegation of foreign journalists permitted to visit Yanan, the remote cave-dwelling capital of the CCP. This visit was facilitated by Zhou Enlil and broke the KMT's year-long information blockade on the communist areas. For Epstein, Yanan was an epiphany. He described the sensation as entering a brand new world. In stark contrast to the demoralized, conscripted armies of KMT, Epstein saw the soldiers of the 8th Route Army working in the fields alongside the peasantry. He reported on the Great Production Movement, noting that northern Shaanxi had been transformed from a wasteland into a region of intense farming and flourishing handcrafty industry. During the visit, Epstein interviewed the top leadership of CCP, including Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlil and Zhou De. He became convinced that the CCP represented the future of China. He wrote to Elise Fairfax Chumley, describing Yanan as a great nation on a small scale. The experience cemented his ideological conversion, believing he shared the same world outlook as the CCP. Following his return from Yanan, Epstein traveled to Britain in 1944 and then moved to the United States. That same year, he married Elise Fairfax Chumley, solidifying their partnership forged during the escape from Hong Kong. The couple lived in the United States for 5 years, 1945 to 1951. In America, Epstein worked tirelessly as an advocate for the Chinese Revolution. He published The Unfinished Revolution in China, 1947, a seminal text that argued against the U.S. support for Chiang Kai-shek and predicted the communist victory. He and Elise worked with the Committee for a Democratic Far Eastern Policy, trying to influence the U.S. foreign policy during the critical years of the Chinese Civil War. However, the political climate in the U.S. was rapidly darkening. The onset of the Cold War and the rise of McCarthyism made life increasingly precarious for left-wing intellects. The organizations Epstein associated with were labeled subversive, and the atmosphere of anti-communist hysteria made their advocacy work dangerous. In 1951, Soong Ching-ling sent a personal invitation to Epstein and Elise to return to their newly founded People's Republic of China. Their mission was to establish an international publication to counter Western narratives about the new China. They arrived in Beijing to found China Reconstructs, later named China Today, an English language magazine designed to showcase the achievements of the socialist state. Epstein served as the executive editor and later editor-in-chief, a position that made him one of the most propagandists in the non-pejorative sense of the term within the CCP for the new regime. In 1957, Epstein took the extraordinary step of renouncing his stateless status and becoming a naturalized Chinese citizen. In 1964, he was formally admitted into the CCP, a rare honor for a foreign-born individual, cementing his status as an insider. The Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976 was a cataclysmic period of political purging initiated by Mao Zedong. Initially, foreign experts like Epstein participated in the movement, viewing it as necessary purification of the party. However, as the movement descended into factional chaos, xenophobia surged. The foreign friends were suddenly reimagined as foreign spies. In 1968, Epstein fell victim to the hysteria. He was accused of plotting against Premier Zhou Enlai, who is accused of plotting against Premier Zhou Enlai, a fabrication that was particularly ironic given his close personal relationship with Zhou. Other accusations include being a spy for the British or American intelligence. The logic was circular. His international background, once an asset, was now proof of his treachery. Epstein, along with Elise and other prominent foreigners like Sidney Rettenberg, Michael Shapiro, and David Crook, was arrested. The crackdown was total. Their children were reportedly confined in a hotel room in Beijing with the windows sealed and paper covered, effectively placing them under house arrest. Epstein was incarcerated in Qincheng Prison, a maximum security facility in Changping district north of Beijing, built with Soviet aid to house high-ranking political prisoners. Epstein was held in solitary confinement for the majority of his 5-year imprisonment from 1968 to 1973. The psychological intent was to break the prisoner's will through total isolation. The cells were small, 5 to 10 square meters, and sanitary conditions were primitive, with prisoners forced to squat and carry water to flush toilets. Reports indicate that prisoners often suffered from severe calcium deficiencies due to lack of sunlight, leading to the loss of teeth and hair. Handcuffs were frequently used as a tool of punishment and control. In his memoir, My China I, Epstein revealed the coping strategies he employed to survive the crushing loneliness and a potent reclamation of his heritage. He admitted that he had told himself Jewish jokes to keep his mind active and his spirits up. Despite being a professed atheist who had argued against the Bundist traditions of his father in the depths of Qincheng, he retreated to the cultural resilience of his ancestors. He also utilized the time to study Chinese characters immensely, transforming his cell into a study hall, refusing to let imprisonment and atrophy affect his intellect. Political winds shifted following the death of Lin Biao and the slow reassertion of control by Zhou Enlai. In 1973, Epstein and Elise were released in a spectacle characteristic of the CCP's rehabilitation processes. The release was followed by a high-profile apology. They were invited to a state dinner at the Great Hall of the People on March 8, 1973, International Women's Day. Premier Zhou Enlai publicly apologized to the foreign experts, stating that they had been treated wrongly and that we made a very bad mistake. Crucially, Epstein did not emerge from Qincheng as a dissident. He rationalized his suffering as necessary, if painful, part of the revolutionary process. He told the New York Times that the imprisonment, quote, had helped him improve by shrinking his ego, end quote. He argued that the Cultural Revolution, despite its excesses, contained good qualities, such as the absence of greed, and he remained a loyal party member until his death. Following his rehab, Epstein returned to his work at China Today, formerly China Reconstructs. He became a revered elder in this, serving on the Standing Committee of the Chinese People Political Consultative Conference, the CPPCC, a prestigious advisory body. He was regularly consulted by top leaders including Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin on matters of international communication. Elise Fairfax Chumley passed away in 1984. In his later years, Epstein found companionship marrying Huang Huangbi, a Chinese national and lifelong colleague. Huang Huangbi became the guardian of his legacy. In the interviews and lectures given after his death, she emphasized his unwavering commitment to the party, stating he, quote, supports China because the Communist Party of the China is right. What he appreciated most was the Communist Party is for the poor, end quote. Epstein remained a prolific writer. His major works include The People's War in 1939, The Unfinished Revolution in China in 1947, The Tibet Transformed 1983, a work praised by the CCP's policies in Tibet, which he visited 4 times, and Women in World History, Soong Ching-ling, 1993, a biography of his mentor, My China Eye, Memoirs of a Jew and a Journalist, his autobiography published shortly before his death. Israel Epstein died on May 26, 2005 in Beijing at the ripe age of 90. His funeral was a state affair attended by President Hu Jintao and Premier Wen Jiabao and other members of the Politburo Standing Committee. He was buried in Baboshan Revolutionary Cemetery, the resting place of China's highest-ranking revolutionary heroes. The final honor confirmed his unique status, a boy from Warsaw who became a founding father of the CCP's international voice. Now, he was a man of multiple displacements, a Jew in Tsarist Russia, a European in Colonial China, a spy in Maoist China, yet in the Chinese Communist Party. He found the belonging history had denied his family in Europe. His ability to endure the solitary confinement in Qincheng Prison without losing faith in the party that imprisoned him remains kind of crazy, and the fact that to his detractors it was a form of intellectual lobotomization, to his admirers it was the ultimate proof of his revolutionary steel. Damn, like, just a weird story. So yeah, that's kind of it. Yeah, I don't even know how long this is. This is like way too long. We gotta edit it. But if you made it to the end, what am I taking away from this? Or what am I expecting you to take away from this? Dude, like, this is weird. I personally... Okay. So, I'm a Sephardic Jew. My family's from the 1496 diaspora. That, like, my grandfather's cousin was the chief rabbi of Turkey. I'm a secular Jew. I'm probably, if anything, a deitist, which means, like, God's not active. If there is a God, there's no material phenomenon to prove or disapprove of his existence. So it's, like, weird, and I really think he's just a grifter. I mean, if for China, he's awesome. Like, I think if you're a Chinese person watching this video, or someone of Chinese descent, like, he's good for you. Like, he was great. I think British, European, Westerners see him as a grifter. As someone who went where he was going to be, I don't want to say profiting the most, but just the most successful. And that's why this happened.